Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning. Welcome to Ethical Perspectives in the News. My name is Pete Welch, suffering from a summertime cold, but this morning we're going to talk about something that's been in the news lately. There was a weekend release last weekend of prisoners from the Gitmo detention facility in Cuba, and we're going to talk about that this morning. With us first this morning is Nathan Miller, who's with the University of Iowa Center for Human Rights. Good morning.
Morning. Pleasure to be here.
Next with us is Alice Dahle, who's a member of Amnesty International. Alice, good morning.
Good morning.
And last is Bob Rush, who's with the law firm of Rush and Nicholson here in Cedar Rapids.
Good morning.
Good morning. First of all, thank you for joining me. Would anybody like to describe what happened to create the base at Gitmo? Bob, a little background?
Well, post 9/11, all kinds of so-called combatants, enemy combatants.
Well, let's go back to how it is the United States acquired.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The base.
1898, I think we can go all the way back to the Spanish-American War, and the United States aligned with Cuba that was under the control of Spain, overcame the Spanish, drove the Spanish out of Cuba, and we worked out a lease arrangement with Cuba for our part of the island, Guantanamo, for $2,000 a year. But then about 20 or 30 years later, the lease was increased to $4,000 a year. And it's my understanding we send a check every year for $4,000 that the Cuban government does not cash.
Okay, now, having been in the Navy myself, I know that it also functions as a naval base. But what has happened about the brig or the detention facility, if you will?
Well, I think post 9/11, the United States had taken into their control a number of combat folks that were enemies, deemed enemy combatants, and that there was a need to interrogate, to hold, and Guantanamo Bay was selected as the holding place and the interrogation center, free of restraints on interrogation and free of the awkwardness of having to deal with any constitutional rights somebody might have should they be actually on the land of the United States.
Alan, can you explain what difference it would be to be on the land versus overseas? Anybody?
Sure. I mean, I think part of the idea was that it was not within the territory of the United States and therefore not under the Constitution of the United States because it's not part of our country. But at the same time, since it wasn't necessarily under the sovereign control of Cuba either, it might not be subject to international law. So it was selected precisely because it was understood at the time, at least, to be a legal black hole.
Okay. Are you insinuating that if we brought those prisoners to the continental United States, they acquire constitutional rights like the United States citizens?
Well, they would acquire certainly some rights under our law, and in fact, they already have. So in the initial years of Guantanamo detention, we didn't necessarily think that the prisoners there could challenge their detention under habeas corpus. And of course, the Supreme Court eventually ruled that they could. And a lot of those challenges are ongoing. So yes, I do believe that if the prisoners had initially been brought into the territory of the United States, then it would have been much harder to argue for as long as the administrations did that they were not subject to United States laws.
Alice, Amnesty's position?
But Amnesty would say that everyone is covered by international human rights law, no matter where they are, whether they're in a place that is covered by a national jurisdiction or not. Those rights are universal and they apply to everybody regardless of where they are. So we see them as having human rights because they are human, and those rights have been ignored for a long time.
Okay, well, nobody's used the word that these people that are there have been terrorists and killed others. So you think they have rights like everybody else, Alice?
I think everybody has rights, and nobody has proven that they're terrorists. That's part of the problem. Many of them are there without any charge. They have no idea why they're there. Many of them were not picked up on battlefields. They were picked up sometimes for a bounty. They were more or less sold to the United States by warlords where they were. So we can't just paint them all as terrorists. We have no idea which ones are and aren't. That's part of the problem. If we could prove that these people were dangerous in some way, we could charge them and bring them to court, and that hasn't happened.
And I'll even take that a step further, I think, and just say bluntly, yes, terrorists have the same rights as anyone else under law. And international law has a whole series of treaties and other laws specifically designed to cover people who are caught up on a battlefield, whether they're members of the regular forces of the state that you're fighting, or whether they're irregular combatants, and those laws have been around for decades, and I have not heard a strong argument that would lead me to believe that those laws should not be applied to folks caught up in the global war on terror.
Are you saying now some of the people that have been released have returned to terrorist activities in Yemen and others, and so they deserve the same rights as the bulk of the civilians of the world, so that they can go terrorize again? Is that more important to you?
Well, I mean, I think we can answer that question by asking a question. So we know in the United States that we have high recidivism rates for a lot of the crimes for which people are imprisoned and later released. Does the fact that some people, upon being released from serving a sentence for murder, go out and kill again mean that we should indefinitely detain everyone that we suspect, haven't proven, suspect of being a murderer indefinitely? I don't see the answer there. And I would apply the same logic to people who are accused of terrorism.
Have you seen the recidivism for these people that have been released? That's more than twice the U.S. prison average. Coming back into being terrorists, does that surprise you at all?
No, I didn't know that, but it doesn't particularly surprise me. But I also think there's a question there of cause and effect. One wonders if you have someone who was not, let's say, actually predisposed to terrorism or to participating in terrorist activities, who, upon being caught up in an illegal detention site and subjected to enhanced interrogation techniques over a long period of time, if that might not have the effect of inciting a certain level of anger.
Okay. One of the solutions has been to open up Marion, Illinois, and transfer all these people here. How would you feel about having a bunch of people like this living just miles away from where you live?
If they were charged with a crime, and if they were actually headed for a fair trial under international standards, that would be okay. In fact, many of them would welcome knowing when the end was in sight, that they would have a chance to face the charges against them, that they would know what the charges were even. So that would be a step in the right direction, actually, to put them into a fair trial legal court system rather than indefinite detention where they are now. We can't hold people just because of hate or ignorance, not knowing what is going on with these people. We have to have a good reason and actually process them fairly according to international standards.
And Peter, we already are incarcerating at least 2 to 3 times the number of terrorists in the United States that we have housed at Guantanamo. including the Oklahoma City accomplice to the bombing in Oklahoma City. We have a number of convicted terrorists in high security prisons in the United States. One good reason from an economic standpoint, which putting aside other good reasons, it's costing the American taxpayers almost $5 million a year to house a prisoner at Guantanamo. At Anamosa State Prison, on average around the country, it's about $32,000 to house somebody, incarcerate somebody. In a high security facility, it might be twice that, but $5 million seems to be a waste of a lot of good money.
Well, the United States clearly is out of pace with the rest of the world because we imprison twice as much a percentage of our population than any other civilized country. But Alice brought up a point about prosecute by international standards or prosecute by U.S. standards. Would you comment on that?
Well,
how much
it's
equity do we get in the International Court of The Hague?
That could take a long time to discuss. However, I think the frustration, the challenge for America is to deal with this so-called enemy combatants. We don't know if all of those prisoners are terrorists. They've been declared enemy combatants. They're not prisoners of war, of a conventional war that we can recognize, somebody we've defeated on the battlefield and taken prisoner. These are a species we've not become very acquainted with on how to deal with people.
Yeah.
Actually, a number of these have been cleared for release, but we don't have a place to send them that's willing to accept them or that we can be sure that they won't go back to their old
ways.
Colleagues. Yes.
Would you care to comment on the ones that were released to Saudi Arabia?
There were actually 10 on the list, but 9 of them were sent back to Saudi Arabia. It was a long negotiation for it to happen. Saudi Arabia actually, most of them are Yemenis that were sent back to Saudi Arabia right now. It was the intention of the administration that they would go back to Yemen, but because of the ongoing conflict there right now, it wasn't a good situation to send them back into. There was no chance that they would be rehabilitated or reintegrated into society because that society is in chaos right now. So it was negotiated that they should go to Saudi Arabia. And actually, one of the princes in Saudi Arabia has set up a rehabilitation center specifically for people who have been in extremist groups that are fighting these religious wars, according to them. These 9 people who were sent back to Saudi Arabia will be going into that rehabilitation center. It's called the Center for Advice and Counseling and Care. And they spend time there talking about their religion, trying to get them to be less militant in their thinking about their religion. They provide visits with the families, they provide jobs, transportation, they try to reintegrate them into society. And all of those who are being sent back to Saudi Arabia this past weekend have family members in Saudi Arabia.
Okay,
that's why they were selected.
And out of the people that perpetrated 9/11, wasn't the figure something like 17 or 18 out of the 24 were all Saudis? Isn't that kind of like, sending them back to Saudi?
This center was only set up in 2007. They realized there was a need for it. So it has been specifically designed to deal with the needs of people coming back from these extremist groups.
I've traveled Russia.
Mm-hmm.
When I traveled Russia, it was before 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
You used to provide security by taking your bags to the plane with you and putting them on, and they put them on the same, because back then the mentality was you weren't going to blow yourself up. When people want to blow themselves up, what do they care about family? Nathan, did you want to add something?
No, I just think that, that talking about an entire country and culture, Saudi, isn't sending them back to Saudi Arabia just like sending them back into terrorism. Certainly many, I don't know the exact number, but yes, most of the 9/11 bombers were Saudis, and all of the people who blew up the federal building in Oklahoma City were Americans. And so I wouldn't tar all of Saudi Arabia with the brush of the 9/11 hijackers any more than I would tar the entire United States with the actions of Timothy McVeigh.
Okay.
You talked about recidivism. The recidivism rate for those coming out of that that care center in Saudi Arabia is only 13%. 87% are considered successful reintegrators into society. So they're having pretty good success right now.
Bob used a term about combatants. And having been former military myself and having worked with NATO, we lost a lot of soldiers due to the rules of engagement, because civilians were saying, this is how we're going to treat a potential combatant situation. And NATO soldiers were told, you cannot work to defend yourself until somebody picks up a gun, draws a bead on you, and is about to kill you, which means it's too late to act because all they have to do is pull a trigger. So we've lost a lot of NATO and a lot of US soldiers subject to that. So when you say combatants and terrorists now, those traditional warfare definitions are changing. Would you agree?
Changing and making it far more difficult for us to deal with it, since we don't have much experience in dealing with so-called enemy combatants.
And one of the things that we do with our press is we tell everybody how we got them, so they have a learning curve of how not to repeat that mistake. Isn't that true?
Well, it's true. If we don't remember how we got here, we're doomed to repeat that mistake for sure.
Well, they'll never repeat it because they won't get cut. They don't want to get caught.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on this because I think it's a crucially important point. I mean, we have these traditional categories of members of the armed forces of a country on the one hand. Maybe there's this middle category of irregular fighters or civilians who are taking up arms. And
militia.
then we have militia, and then we have criminals. And the question is, which category do we put terrorists in? And it's not obvious. It's not obvious under traditional international law, and contemporary international law hasn't really caught up with that. And that's something, I mean, that's a big task in front of international lawyers, politicians, and policymakers for the next probably decade. But within that, I would just want to emphasize that whatever bucket you put them in, wherever you place
Is it
terrorists,
possible they could be present in all the groups?
one individual on different days doing different activities, in theory, sure. But the question that's relevant to Gitmo and to how we treat them in our legal system, or how other countries should treat them in theirs, is that whatever category they fall into, they can and should always enjoy the basic universal guarantees to a fair trial. And you mentioned The Hague, and I thought I would just mention that there's a funny little, there's a law here in the United States called the American Service Members Protection Act, which authorizes us to go and, let's say, reacquire any American service member who finds themselves hauled up before the International Criminal Court in The Hague. And the reason that we have that law is that we feel that it is our duty to, if any of our service members need to face some sort of justice or discipline, it is our job to dispense that, and we don't necessarily trust the due process in The Hague. And so shouldn't we act in the same way towards other combatants as we would prefer the world to act towards ours?
And if we don't, how can we expect the rest of the world to treat our military people differently if they fall into other hands?
We could do a whole show on this topic alone, since I wore that uniform overseas. Mm-hmm. But there is kind of the thing about, he who has shaped the rules and enforced them has the dignity that if they're acting in accordance with their own rules. And that's, I think, a big thing about CONUS and out CONUS. CONUS meaning continental United States. Mm-hmm. Did any of you lose any friends in 9/11?
No.
I lost some friends. They were fellow military, and they worked in New York, and it does affect you.
Absolutely.
But do you want revenge or do you want justice?
It depends on how you define it. But what I would like would be safety for the American people. And safety means no fear of getting on a plane. You know, if I wanted to fly safe, I'd fly El Al everywhere, but it doesn't fly around the United States. So, Bob, what do you think?
I think the common denominator among many of us is that America has to find again its moral ground to speak of. 9/11, perhaps there was a moment in time where Guantanamo was okay. Maybe it was okay for a short period of time, but here we are, a decade or more beyond that, searching for moral ground. And if we are to be an influence in this country, in this world for positive change, don't we have to set that standard and set the standard with how we are treating enemy combatants, POWs, or prisoners?
Would Gitmo be a repeated mistake of the Japanese detention camps of the American Japanese in World War II?
It's more
Perhaps.
than that. Gitmo has involved torture. It has involved one human rights abuse after another. It isn't only a matter of holding people there. They've been badly treated. They have not been charged with any reason to be there. It's been 15 years in limbo, basically, for many of these people.
What if torture saves in American lives?
Torture is
You don't
never
care?
okay.
You don't care?
No, we do care. We care tremendously, but it's safer for everybody if we abide by human rights laws for everybody. If we violate those human rights laws, then others will violate the human rights of our soldiers when they're caught.
Well, if we look at an insane asylum, those people are all sincere, but why are they in the asylum? They don't fit the mold of society as a general or a whole because of things they want to do that infringe on the majority. Well, terrorist is the same.
But these people haven't been necessarily found to be terrorists. We don't have evidence that shows that at all. If we did, we could put them on trial, but we don't have that evidence. In many cases, they weren't terrorists, but we don't know who was and who wasn't. It was very sloppily done, and torture has only led to evidence we can't use, because you can make anybody say something to end the pain, but it isn't necessarily something that's true. It's just what they think you want to hear, so you will stop the torture.
And if it saves lives, you don't...
It won't save lives if it's not true. It will only stop the torture.
And the research is not there to show that torture does
Right.
in fact save lives. I mean, you can paint the Jack Bauer scenario that there's a ticking time bomb and all you have to do is torture this one guy until he gives it up and you save a whole city of people. But intelligence doesn't work that way, and the research is not there to show that torture does in fact save lives. Even if the research were there, I would still oppose it because you can't put that genie back in the bottle. But I don't need to go there because the research isn't there.
Well, history teaches us from just 100 years of the Spanish Inquisition that torture doesn't do anything other than ruin a population and exterminate people.
Well, how do we curb these type of activities that the terrorists are doing then? We just allow it to happen because their rights are equal to everybody else's?
Well, I would say their rights are not equal, in my humble opinion, to everyone else's. Some basic rights, yes, but they don't have the same rights as we enjoy under our Constitution. Should they? Different question. But how do we conquer? How do we deal with terrorism? Big questions. Lots of theories out there on how to cope with terrorism. Certainly poverty, illiteracy, health, some basic fundamental rights that each citizen of this world should enjoy and have access to. Those would be starters, I think.
Well, it sounds like you're trying to bring everybody up like Bernie Sanders or something, and give them something so that they don't want to risk anything.
Human rights do bring everybody up. Everybody has a right to have some dignity and to be treated as a decent human being. Even if they've done terrible things, then they can be prosecuted and punished, of course, but they do have the right to a fair trial. And the people who are responsible for torturing are the ones who should also be brought to trial.
Well, we also have some issues with what type of rights system you have. For example, if you've got Sharia law and you steal something, they cut off your hand. Mm-hmm. That doesn't go well here. Mm-hmm. So you've got different systems and different people believing in different systems.
Now that's a violation of human rights, obviously, and that should not be in there.
Not under Sharia law.
Oh, but that is not a human rights system. That is a legal system.
Well, it's more, some will call it religious system.
And that particular aspect of Sharia law, if that is how it's practiced in a certain place, of course it varies, and that's a particularly extreme version of it, would be contrary to international human rights standards. Back to the question of how to curb terrorism, I agree with Bob. I think you attack the underlying causes is certainly one of the ways. You look at why people become terrorists and you try to eliminate those underlying conditions. At the same time, recognizing that people are still going to be going out there and doing bad things. And in the same way that different activities can put them in different legal categories, like we were talking about just a little bit ago, different types and patterns of terrorism might require different approaches. Sometimes it might be a war type approach like it was when we went into Afghanistan just after 9/11. Other times it might be a law enforcement approach, like when we send the FBI, as we do, all over the world to investigate bombings and other things and try to find the perpetrators and bring them to justice.
Okay. Well, isn't the most important job of the United States government to provide security for its citizens? Isn't that the bottom line here?
No.
Oh, really?
No, I would say I would pick liberty over security almost any day.
Well, you prefer the asylum?
I don't know that an asylum is liberty, but I'll
they go
take
hand
liberty
in
over
hand.
security.
Yes, they do.
They go hand in hand, right?
They go hand in hand?
I think so.
We've got to have some rules to live by, Bob.
Absolutely, I agree. But we don't have freedom unless we have rules. And the rule of law is what we adhere to in this country. And that's what protects freedom and our rights of freedom. But we also need to enforce our rules, and that's what security is. And certainly any exterior enemies, our top of our list is to defend against those interests.
And we need to enforce our rules not only against the bad guys, but against our own government as well.
Okay, well, we've had a lively conversation this morning. I'd like to thank all of you for joining me this morning. And on behalf of the Interreligious Council for Cedar Rapids and Iowa City, thank you for joining us this morning, and go out and make our community a safer place to live, work, and play. Thank you.